This is Twisted Minds, an 8-part podcast serial about what makes criminals tick and the people who dedicate their lives to finding out. When a person is charged with a violent crime, life becomes a series of rapid-fire questions. Questions from police, lawyers and prison staff. But if there's anyone a crook will let their guard down with, it's their psyche. These are the experts who dig beneath the hard facts of a crime to discover the why.
He killed for the thrill of it, in my view, and it was just a crime to see if he could get away with it. And he didn't. Would he kill again if he was let out? I wouldn't want to live next door to him.
That's forensic psychologist Dr. Susan Pullman. She's talking about Daniel Kelsall, one of her former clients. Kelsall was just 20 years old when he followed handsome young businessman Morgan Huxley home from the pub and stabbed him to death in his bed. There was no motive, no provocation, and the killer had no history of violence. This was a murder that happened in a wealthy neighbourhood on Sydney's North Shore, rattling locals and Australia with its bizarreness.
Now to another crime that was so disturbing it was hard to forget. Morgan Huxley was stalked and then stabbed to death by a stranger at his apartment in Neutral Bay. It was a shocking, motiveless crime, but his killer believes his punishment was too harsh.
Considered one of the most wicked of killers, Daniel Kelsall, just 20, when he sought and stalked his victim Morgan Huxley, stabbing him over 20 times as he slept inside his Neutral Bay apartment in 2013.
He followed him home late at night and stabbed him in his sleep in what the judge described as the most chilling case of murder.
Dr. Susan Pullman told the court that Kelsall thought about killing someone with a knife on the way home from work at night. Now, the Huxley family watched from the gallery as she said Kelsall told her he took a knife home one night but didn't meet anyone.
The sentencing judge acknowledged his youth by not imposing a life sentence. She says Kelsall has shown no empathy for the Huxley family and has never expressed remorse.
My name is Susan Pullman. I'm a forensic neuropsychologist. I've been working as a psychologist for 30 years in the field of forensic psychology and clinical neuropsychology for 20 years. So the forensic side of it is where you're trained to understand the implications of behaviour to the law. So you may work in a correctional setting with high-risk offenders, sexual offenders, the spectrum of different types of offenders that you may come across. So they'll provide a therapeutic environment for them. They'll be involved in rehabilitation. We would also look at sentencing reports before an individual comes up to be sentenced in the District Court or Supreme Court. And we also are trained in looking at risk assessment. So what is the likelihood of this person reoffending in what situation, under what circumstances? So we're given that training, and also we understand the different psychiatric conditions and how they can relate to offending type behaviour, as well as the spectrum of personality disorders and how they can relate to offending. So that's the field, in a nutshell, of forensic psychologists.
So tell me about the different kinds of offenders you've sat down with.
All right. The different types of offenders that I have sat down with over a number of years would include quite a variety, from drug-related offences, fraud cases, homicide, assault, child sexual assault. Really, most of the crimes that anyone could think of, I would have worked in that field.
What kind of people commit murder?
The kind of people that commit murder really covers a broad range of reasons and backgrounds. You have individuals that have had a real history of trauma in their own lives that then lead them to go on and commit a violent offence such as murder. There are those individuals that have a history of drug use that then lead to perhaps a drug-induced psychosis and they commit murder, or they're under the influence of alcohol and they totally lose control over their behaviour. Then there are also those offenders that really leave no explanation for committing the murder. other than perhaps they really wanted to see what they were capable of, have no emotion towards the victim and commit that crime for the thrill of it.
Daniel Kelsall, he's an interesting case.
Sees a stranger he's never met before, walking home from the pub, follows him home, stabs the other young man in his bed, and then does he end up in your office or you met him in prison?
He was in jail, yes. He was in jail because of the offence that he committed. They wouldn't get bail, so I saw him in jail to assess him, yes. So that was such an interesting case because there had been speculation about possible autism spectrum, major depression.
The first time Susan met Daniel Kelsall was inside an interview room at Long Bay Prison in 2013. Kelsall had been charged with the murder of handsome 31-year-old Morgan Huxley. But he looked barely old enough to grow bum fluff, the type of guy you'd expect to find in a high school chess club, not defending a murder charge. On the night Morgan was killed, Kelsall had been working as a kitchen hand at a local cooking school. The two strangers meet by chance at an ATM, across the road from the Oaks pub in Neutral Bay. Here's Kelsall telling police about that first encounter.
For the purpose of this interview, can you just state your full name, date of birth, please?
Daniel Jack Kelsall, born on the 5th of February 1993. I walked into the convenience store where the person who I thought is this guy was trying to get money out of the machine. Very funny. I then had a small conversation. This guy, Morgan?
Yes, Morgan, yes.
Morgan asked me if I wanted to use the money, the ATM.
He asked you, sorry.
He asked me. I replied no and then left.
Kelsall tries to say that after that, he walks home. He denies having any involvement in the murder, but police have CCTV which shows Kelsall stalking Morgan. While Morgan is finishing his drink at the pub, Kelsall can be seen watching him for more than 30 minutes through the pub window. Then when Morgan leaves to go home, Kelsall follows him. Here's detectives showing Kelsall that footage.
Do you know who that is?
It's me.
Why'd you jog?
It's cold. Mum always tells me if you're cold, go for a jog.
How far did you jog for?
Not very far.
There's no denying Kelsall is an odd bloke, but that doesn't mean he's mentally ill. And when Susan sits down with him, she's unsettled by how hard he seems to be pushing the mental health card. From the beginning of the interview, he repeatedly tells her he's been diagnosed as autistic.
He had been to see a psychologist in the past, so he had, and I don't dispute that he'd had some depression in his life. I don't argue against that. When he presented, when I interviewed him, he was very conscious of getting across to me that he'd been diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum, and he just kept emphasising that to me at the beginning of the interview and trying to demonstrate behaviours at the beginning of the interview that might be a bit suggestive of some repetitive type behaviours that you can see.
So Susan realises Kelsall is trying to deceive her. He's hamming up his mental illness to pretend he is much, much sicker than he is, presumably in the hope that having a severe mental illness will be in his favour when his case goes to court.
I felt that it was clear that this was not a genuine case of that diagnosis was incorrect. I didn't agree with the diagnosis, but he was a young man that I think committed the crime for the thrill of it. I don't think there was any diagnosis that would explain his behaviour in the sense of psychiatric diagnosis. He was a very intelligent young man. He was from a loving family. He was adopted. There was nothing that I was aware of within the family that could have contributed to the crime that he committed. He was devoid of empathy, very conscious of wanting to appear. He was an intelligent young man, and testing indicated that he was, like cognitive testing demonstrated he was like within the superior range. And he, as I said before, he was killed for the thrill of it, in my view. And it was just a crime to see if he could get away with it. And he didn't. Would he kill again if he was let out? I wouldn't want to live next door to him. That's for sure, because he just didn't show any remorse at all. And he's dangerous.
When we talk about people who kill for a thrill kills, is that quite rare?
I'd say it's quite rare. I don't come across cases where, like in his situation, there was no use of substances. I'll do a number of cases where they're addicted to illicit substances. They're using ice or cannabis or amphetamines. So they're really in some way out of control at the time they'll commit the murder. And not that that's excusing what they've done, but the plan to just go out there and kill is not something that I come across a lot. I did with another young offender that had said when he was at primary school, I'm going to go out and commit a murder one day. And he subsequently did.
How old was he when he committed the murder?
He was a teenager. I won't say specifically how old, but he was a child that took knives to school. He threatened children in primary school. And the crime that he then committed was something he decided to do to an innocent victim that he didn't know. And he just wanted to do it. He wanted to prove that he could do it. And he did it. Was there any background behind his behaviour? I think part of it was his personality, his antisocial personality. And I think that was, whether I'd use the term thrill kill in that regard, not so much in the sense of can I get away with it, but I am going to commit a murder because I'm going to prove that I'm capable of this level of violence. And he's dangerous. He's a dangerous young man. And he was not someone I'd want to interview again as an adult.
The idea a child so young could be fantasising about murder is disturbing, but only as chilling as the case of a 46-year-old man who one day got up and viciously stabbed his elderly parents to death.
Police initially responded to an emergency call from the Reid household about 8:30 this morning. It was allegedly David, a loner who had never moved out of home, threatening self-harm. But he said nothing to police when they arrived to check on him about what they might find inside. A quiet street in Sutherland where neighbours have known the Reids for decades. 46-year-old David and his parents, Diana and Victor. Their bodies were found in the bedroom and living room.
Look, as an officer that's been around for 34 years, and I've worked in investigation a hell of a long time, it never prepares you for what those officers would have been exposed to. I feel for them, I feel for the families of the individuals involved. It's always a horrific scene to deal with, but we do have a great deal of welfare support for our officers when they get exposed to these type of events.
On a cold winter's morning in 2019, David Reid got up, got dressed for work and stabbed his two elderly parents to death. When David made his attack, his mother was eating breakfast at the dining room table, his father asleep in bed. After killing his parents, he turns the knife on himself then calls 000 threatening self-harm. Nothing about the crime appears to make sense. Susan is called in to assess the 46-year-old IT worker and what drove him to commit such a tragic crime.
If you'd looked at this man's risk of committing a violent offence prior to the murder of his parents, the homicide of his parents, you would say a very, very low risk. There's no indication. So it was very unusual in that regard. And because his presentation, when you interview him, is very unusual, and he was a very difficult case for psychiatrists to classify as far as trying to understand this man does not present as your typical 46, 47-year-old man.
David Reed might not present like a typical 46-year-old man psychologically, but physically, he looks exactly as you'd expect a 46-year-old IT worker to look. He's Caucasian and of average height and build, with a slight office paunch. His brown hair is cut in a regular clean-cut style and he wears glasses. There's nothing about his appearance that looks in the least bit threatening. The first time Susan meets him, they sit down in the prison interview room.
When I first met him, in the first few minutes, I thought to myself, there is a very complex story here. And you first meet the man and you ask him a question, and then he is very slow to respond, and you think, did he hear me? Should I ask this question again? Did you hear me, David? And he'll look around and he takes so long to process any questions about emotions, or it was completely alien to him for me to be asking some of the questions I asked him about his upbringing. And some of it he had no memory of. And so I realised that this is going to take me some time. I want to understand his psyche. What was he like? What does he remember as a child when he went to school? Where did he go to school? What was it like when he came home? I wanted to, just understand him.
Susan kept asking questions, slowly putting together the pieces of the puzzle.
I probably spent about 6-7 hours interviewing him over a period of time. And what struck me about him, even though he's an adult, is I've seen those sorts of behaviours and reactions in children and adolescents in the work I did in the field of child protection. So this is why I was trying to work out what is happening with this man that has led to this desperate act. And my own opinion in the matter was that this was a young boy, probably quite socially awkward, extremely bright, 2 children in the family, and being brought up in a very religious environment. And certainly his parents provided for him materially. He didn't ever go hungry. He had everything that he needed. And there was no physical abuse whatsoever. I mean, no evidence of that. But he described to me a number of behaviours that raised alarm bells for me, in the sense that it looked like from a very young age what I would describe as emotional deprivation. And I'm not saying that that was deliberate on the part of the parents. We don't necessarily understand why we do what we do or how we interact with our children, in the sense of what that can mean for a child and the way their brain develops. And my view was that this was a young boy who, from his description, was never really given a hug. He described to me that he was raised in an environment where you don't express your feelings. That's not something we do. We don't talk about feelings. We don't acknowledge them. We don't validate them. We just behave in a set way, and these are expectations of us. And I had a sense of a young boy growing up in an environment where his feelings weren't validated. He was, from what he told me, and you could argue, look, this is a fellow that's murdered his parents, how do you know what he's saying is true? But just sitting with him for a while, I developed this sense of, I bet this is what he was exposed to, given the way he's presenting to me. My interpretation of this behaviour is emotional deprivation. So I asked him a series of questions about what it was like when he came home from school, what used to happen in your school holidays, we talked about that in extensive detail, and I got a picture of someone that felt, from their perception, that they were unloved. They were not loved. They weren't acknowledged as an individual. And if they did express their own views, they were criticised. So I got this idea of a very controlling environment in which he was raised. And if that's the case, that he did not get the emotional reciprocity that a child needs when they're growing up, their brain does develop differently. He does not remember being told, well done, doesn't remember ever being told that it's okay or I love you as a child. He doesn't remember being given a hug. He doesn't remember any of the normal happy times that a child would describe to you when they're growing up. And that was quite striking to me.
Over years working in the children's courts, Susan has assessed hundreds of children from abusive or deprived backgrounds, and she recognised some similarities in the way David Reed was describing his perception of his childhood. We will never know what really went on, but at least from where Reed stood, it was clear he never felt loved or appreciated.
And we know that from the literature, from scanning of children's brains that are in severe emotional deprived environments. We know that their brains do develop differently and quite separate from any physical punishment, right? A lot of members of the public would say, well, look, we never hit our children, we always provided a house, a roof, we've funded everything that they needed. I never once hit my child. What more can they complain about? But what the public doesn't understand is that emotional development is just as critical as those other aspects of what you provide your children for. If a child grows up not feeling that they're listened to, they're told to be quiet, don't say that. If they're never told that they're loved, and that's okay, that you didn't do so well at school, if they're constantly criticised, they're not permitted to express emotion, then their brains develop in such a way that the connections within the brain, if you don't use it, you lose it. We've all heard that saying. And what happens with children that are in an emotionally deprived environment is that the connections that develop in a young child's brain that ignites feelings of empathy, understanding of emotion, those connections drop off. So, and they don't then redevelop. If that child has not been nurtured and felt good about themselves, you have a child that grows up with a very poor self-concept and a lack of who am I, very, very low self-esteem. And you see this combined with physical abuse in the correctional system all the time. So we're not necessarily talking about someone who you can compare to another fellow the same age in the community, because they develop quite differently. And I think in this situation, from my understanding, speaking to Mr. Reed, he didn't even understand some emotions when I talked to him about describe how you're feeling, or sadness or anger and love, and he He really struggled understanding some of those emotions. So I think what we saw here was a man that had, from his perception, had no place in the world. That's what I believe was happening to this man, and he got to the stage where he could no longer control his despair in such a way that he lost control of his actions, and hence a tragic event occurred, and it was his intention to also take his own life as well.
In fact, when Susan gave Reid an MRI to check his brain function, the results were startling.
I said this in my report to the court. This is not a normal profile. This is a profile of someone who's had a severe brain injury, but he has never had a brain injury. But that's how the brain is presenting. Aspects of his judgment and problem solving on the testing that I did was impaired, and I looked at this profile and I thought, this is a man who appears to have had a brain injury, but he's never had a brain injury. So what has happened here? So and when I say abnormal, I mean grossly abnormal. I mean statistically an abnormal profile that would indicate this brain is not functioning in the way a 47-year-old man's brain should be functioning. So his knowledge of physics, chemistry and everything was all intact. I mean, a very, very intelligent man, but aspects of his reasoning, his problem solving, his ability to process information quickly was impaired like a brain injury. And I think that caused some of the bizarreness in this man's presentation.
Sitting in court, and obviously you're a couple of metres from the offender. His brother was sitting one seat in front of me, who had obviously lost his parents too, and it really did strike me as how desperately sad this was, because one of the narratives that came through for me in that court process was how helpful he had been with the police. He had never tried to hide his actions, to try and lie. His family had all described him as, if anything, kind of retiring, the kind of person who wouldn't even kind of take you on in a verbal argument.
And the family, speaking to members of the family, they have been, my discussions with them, they were supportive of Mr. Reid. They just saw this a tragic set of circumstances, and whilst they acknowledged that there needed to be some form of sentencing for him, given the horrific crime that he committed, that he needed to serve some time in prison, of course. However, there was also that sense from the family, look, we don't want to see him rot in prison. We want to see him serve time for what he's done, but we don't want to see him in there forever. This is a really sad situation. He'd been no one had described him as being antisocial, cruel, or violent, or showing even any antisocial tendencies before. He'd been in the same job for a long, long time, and by all accounts was doing a good job. He's an extremely brilliant man, intellectually, extremely intelligent, and unfortunately someone that has not lived up to their potential.
When David Reid's case goes to court, his charges are downgraded from double murder to double manslaughter charges. He pleads guilty to manslaughter, with his lawyer arguing he was so mentally impaired that he cannot be held criminally responsible for the murders. Susan is one of 4 forensic psychologists and psychiatrists to assess him. All agree there is something terribly wrong with David's mental functioning, but none are confident to label him with a diagnosis. His case is so complex that even the experts are flummoxed.
His presentation is so overwhelmingly flat and depressed when you talk to him that it can be misinterpreted as him even having an intellectual disability, because he's so incredibly slow when you ask him a question. It's a very, very sad series of events, but he did seek help. There's no doubt about it. He did cry out for help prior to this event occurring. He did see a number of people about his feelings, but it would take him a while to really open up to what was going on in his life. You really have to persevere. Could it have been prevented? We all look back on that with hindsight, but if you were to meet him in therapy prior to the event, you wouldn't have thought that he was in any way capable of what he did. No way. There's no one would think he could do this. He was capable of it, but he did.
For the manslaughter of his parents, David Reed was sentenced to a maximum of 10 years and 6 months. He will be eligible for parole after 5 years in 2025. The judge said that these were terrible crimes committed in tragic circumstances, but that to have a complete understanding of the offences, the court had to consider the role of mental illness in these tragic events.
Do I think he'll do it again? Look, the fact that he's committed such a violent crime is always going to be there, and because of that, we're going to always be very cautious with anyone that's committed such violence that they can do it again. I just don't know that the set of circumstances are going to be there again that would lead him to do what he did.
When Susan talks about the David Reed case, her blue eyes take on a fiery fierceness. You can tell she genuinely believes Reed is as much a victim of his past mental impairments as he is a killer. But she's not always so empathetic. Some killers don't have a redeeming bone in their body.
A statewide manhunt ended when John Walsh checked into a motel at Hay, 400 kilometres southwest of his Cowra home. Police say he axed his 2 grandchildren to death, 5-year-old Jamie and 7-year-old Kevin, and his wife Mabel, before attacking his own daughter, Senior Constable Shelley Walsh.
I remember looking at the clock and going, yep, they should all be awake now.
7-year-old Kevin and 5-year-old Jamie often stayed at their grandparents' house while their mum was at work. But on the 30th of June 2008, Shelley Walsh returned to her parents' Cowra home to find her father all alone.
There was just something different about his voice, like it wasn't quite my dad.
He describes acts of murder as if he were explaining how to change a tyre.
I'd be interested to hear your perspective on John Walsh.
You met him in prison?
I met him in prison many years ago now. It would have been in Long Bay. And I was asked to see him for the reason there was concerns that he may have a dementing illness. And if he did have dementia and was starting to behave in a bizarre way with challenging behaviours, perhaps there was some indication that he wasn't functioning in the way he previously had. So that was my brief in that matter, and there was no evidence of any dementia. And I wasn't asked in that case to really look at why it happened. It was more a referral for determining dementia or not. But there was no... It was a very, very different presentation to other bizarre murders, if we can use that word. I didn't feel any sense of sadness or remorse or this is a tragedy like I had in other cases where, look, I'm sorry this has happened, I'm really sad about it, what have I done? There was none of that. And like, I can remember him saying after he killed his grandchildren, he went and had breakfast. And I thought that was, how do you do that? How do you do that? You're there to protect young children, that biological urge to protect your own children or grandchildren, and that wasn't there. So he was quite a bizarre case to come across. And I do remember, and I might have mentioned this to you once before, that when I actually met him, he said, "Oh, would you like a cup of tea?" You know, and I thought, this was just very strange, very, very strange interaction that was. It was like very matter of fact with what he'd done. Didn't seem to be concerned that he was in prison, didn't worry him, and didn't seem to have any feeling of remorse or this is a terrible tragedy. It was...
He was offering to make you a cup of tea in prison.
Yes. Yes, he was.
It's quite polite.
I thought, right, how polite. He subsequently killed someone in jail after that, you know. He was sharing a cell with this other fellow that I'd interviewed, and John Walsh then killed him. So he just killed again with the deadly weapon of the Breville sandwich maker.
It is a deadly weapon. It's always in trouble in prison. The kettle is always often used too to scald people with boiling water. And I mean, obviously you can't kill people with urine, but that's obviously another prison weapon that I often hear about.
The man who fell foul of John Walsh's sandwich press was Frank Townsend, who was in jail for the shooting death of a woman. John Walsh received a life sentence for the crime, in addition to the 3 he was already serving for killing his family. Like so many of Susan's clients, he will see out the end of his days in a prison cell. Next episode, we meet Professor Jim Ogloff, a psychologist who has sat down with the men behind some of Australia's most horrific crimes. He'll share what it was like to interview Jill Maher's killer, to assess the sadistic predator who killed Eurycides Dixon, and the conversation he had with the twisted school cleaner who killed Stephanie Scott on the eve of her wedding. I'm Amelia Saw, and this is Twisted Minds.